Okay. I'm aware that this was a very short break, but I'm especially pleased to welcome our next speaker, Jolita Zabarskaitė, who also conceived this conference together with Benjamin Zachariah, and I want to thank her for that. She's an expert on the topic. She studied Indology and is right now affiliated with the Southeast Asian Studies Department at the University of Bonn. We are a bit out of our timetable, but since Jolita is very important for this conference, I would also like to give her the full time slot. So the floor is yours, Jolita.
Thank you. I will try my best to keep long. So my talk will be probably a bit different. Well, it's actually focused also on India and on Indonesia. And in my talk, as you can already guess, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of Greater India, which was used in India from the 1880s to 1950s. In this period when protagonists of this Greater India discourse attempted to make a case for the importance of an Indian nation state as an expansionist state and its culture. And it was intended to raise awareness about India as a great civilizational power in the past, which could be emerged once again, so to say. From the past, you bring the right to become a nation state and a great power in the near future. Greater India was in many respects an Indian construction of Indian colonization, but had to be different from the Western imperialism of the Roman Empire. This Indian expansion was viewed as a peaceful cultural colonization and yet imperialistic. While Indians might intend to frame the colonialism as a different from the Western, they relied actually on the same sources or interpretations of the sources which were studied and analyzed by the Western scholars. So this narrative of Greater India perceived as an Asian culture shaped by ancient Indian civilizational influence had emerged largely due to French, British, or Dutch Indologists who described the prehistory of their own colonies in the Dutch East Indies or French Indochina under this kind of civilizational influence of ancient India. The same Dutch, French, and British histories were read and used not only by Indian intellectuals, but also in Indonesia, by Indonesians. The same literature was read in both countries, right, in India and Indonesia. Yet, as I will try to fit in time and present, to show that the reception or interpretation by using the same sources were very differently. The Indian narrative extolling Indian civilization was ignored in Indonesia. Indonesians referred rather in criticism of this Indian views. However, this has not really harmed India-Indonesia relations. India-Indonesia links, both historical and contemporary, dominated the coverage in the popular media around this 1940, 1950. The conference in Delhi in 1947 was already a moment when there was this kind of shift from India's superiority, which was framed under this idea of Greater India, to India's partnership and cooperation with other Asian countries. And this cultural superiority argument applied before, let's say, 1947, 1950s, became actually kind of damaging and irrelevant. The scholarship on Southeast Asia could not be framed in the same Indian imperialist narrative of this Greater India. However, it still received attention among Indian historians who tried to push that. But as we will see, the Greater India framework was dismissed because the newly independent countries in South and Southeast Asia were not inclined to accept this kind of narrative of Greater India, which actually suggested way inferiority. So this Hindu cultural supremacy was not accepted by Indonesians, who were nevertheless aware of this kind of debate, of this cultural influence from India in their history, But we Indonesians, preferred to see it as an external influence that had been absorbed and incorporated into an Indonesian cultural entity. So this Greater India idea, as I mentioned, it emerged in the 1880s in India and became a recognized term for itself by around 1920s, before it became institutionalized in the Greater India Society in 1926. European scholars, French and Dutch, besides British, had, of course, influence on the formation of the Greater India idea. The history writings with a focus on Buddhist and Hindu architecture and sculpture in Central Asia or in Southeast Asia led this kind of foundations for Indian scholars to consider this heritage as a part of their own Indian civilization. So ancient Indian influence in Southeast Asia was framed by Indian intellectuals as a Greater India and proposed, as I already mentioned, this kind of a nation state of Hindus as having existed with all its national institutions, including also overseas colonies, before British came. But it was also emphasized the whole Greater India narrative from Indian perspective, that the whole happened even before Islam came to India. A great input in constructing the discourse on this kind of superiority of Indian civilization came from British and also Irish artists and art historians, who were also often members of a Theosophical Society in India. And they framed these Hindu and Buddhist monuments outside India as a kind of Indian national art. And this contributed quite well for legitimating the Indian idea about this all-conquering genius of the Hindu civilization, based not only on Hindu architectural masterpieces outside the Indian subcontinent, but also on maritime shipping and trading activities. And that included also the narrative about the Hindu colonization, which resulted in the foundation of the Greater India. Greater India was discussed by the scholars of Sanskrit, educationalists, the artists and art teachers, scholars on history and history of economics, as well as by very popular journal editors, who were very actively engaged in bringing these all academic discussions into the public domain, as well as travelers who got engaged with this theme while traveling and working abroad outside the Indian subcontinent. Writing histories of Greater India was often argued as writing their own Indian history, while we were dependent, of course, on British and other Western European scholarship. So to say, Indians transferred this European history into their own Indian nationalistic rhetoric. So the focus lied on pre-colonial with an emphasis on pre-Islamic period. Indian discourse on Greater India was this Indian nationalist version of civilizing mission, framing Indian civilization as superior to the Southeast Asian civilization and with a history of expansion and colonization comparable or even to superior to the Europeans. The expansion of Indian cultural achievements and its influence on other cultures was defined mostly as unidirectional Hindu influence, despite the presence of some voices in India who, of course, emphasized this kind of civilizational reciprocal interaction. And this kind of one-way influence, or like interpretation of one-way influence, can be read as an Indian Hindu claim to superiority over others, and also as a claim that there was nothing that India could take in return. The language of civilizational hierarchies used by the Greater India protagonists included claims such as primitive savages in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa and elsewhere, who had been civilized or were in need of being civilized by the Hindus. This theme of Greater India was also used to mobilize Indians abroad from the 1910 to 1930s and even 40s, in an attempt to create this kind of race, religious, and cultural unity of Hindu race, besides, of course, spreading this kind of Hindu culture and social laws among the aboriginals, for instance, in Africa. The theme of Greater India was widely discussed in the same superior civilizational framework in Indian history textbooks and articles, but after it became really very conventional thinking in India, until the whole discourse on Greater India applied in this kind of Hindu nation building did not suit with the independent nation state of India. So here we have Asian Relation Conference, which happened in Delhi in 1947. The conference, which was kind of with the aim to consolidate India's diplomatic ties in Asia. And according to my interpretation and understanding, this is like the moment when it was very clear that Greater India was not a suitable way to discuss Indian position in Asia, framed in this Greater India framework. And this was the moment also in which the demands of an emerging independent Indian state came into kind of conflict with such kind of framing of Hindu civilizing mission. So from this point on, the theme of Greater India was kind of deliberately downplayed or muted. I kind of expected that you will talk more about the Asian Relation Conference, but since you talk more about Bandung, maybe I will very briefly talk about. This information is not based on archive, but like more what was delivered about this Asian International Conference in public media. So this idea of the Asian Conference, which Nehru traced genealogically back to the 1927, to this international meeting in Brussels that founded the League Against Imperialism, was characteristically anti-imperialist, and so it was also anti-imperialist in terms of Hindu cultural or economic imperialism. And based on Nehru's newspaper interviews, this idea for conference was developed with the aim for the understanding Asia's problems, initiating the promotion of cooperation among Asian people. And in public media in India, it was, of course, around already in March 1946, announced that Nehru had this kind of desire to hold this Asian conference. But also, 1 year ago, this kind of idea was already suggested and was also published in Indian public media by the Burmese politician, General Aung San, for this kind of South Asiatic countries conference. So it was already this kind of this idea on Asian conference already circulated since 1945. And the editorials, for instance, the editorial of the Calcutta Daily Hindustan Standard wrote that this kind of conference was very welcomed, not only by Indian politicians, but also by various Bengal politicians who also used this kind of ancient relations with Southeast Asia for the future kind of federation of the Asiatic nations, so to say, to give context for this conference. So in connection with this proposal, the editorial of the Hindustan Standard invoked India's bond with Southeast Asia, which was by then quite conventionally framed part of Greater India, and reasoned on that basis that India's initiative would be to lead the Asian Conference and the future federation. So by appealing to Indian intercourse with Southeast Asia, the editorial of the Hindustan Standard framed this kind of as a good days of India and Southeast Asia. It was determined that there was a brotherhood which India and Southeast Asia shared. In the Indian press, Greater India was used as an inspiring way to engage with Asia, and in particular with Southeast Asia. And actually Nehru invoked kind of these relations with leaders from various countries, from Ceylon, Indonesia, China, Iran, and other countries. He traced back this kind of relationship to this Brussels conference in 1927. And Nehru's idea for this conference was kind of not confined to Southeast Asia, and also not based on this kind of narrative glorifying cultural empire of Greater India. It was rather, as he argued, that all Asian countries, it doesn't matter whether we are talking about Middle East or Southeast Asia, we all impinge on India and all depend on India, whether we are talking economically or politically. So Nehru framed India to be the kind of center of things in Asia, and that view, according to him, was shared also by others. The first Asian conference, which was held in 1947 in New Delhi, was designed to mediate the position of United Asia, where all Asian nations were equal, as delegates, especially delegates from India and China, repeatedly emphasized. In the words of a delegate for China, there was no question of leadership in Asia. And in his speech at the conference, Nehru also expressed that there are no leaders and no followers. All countries of Asia have to meet together on an equal basis. To some extent, however, by framing India's position as a meeting point of Asian cultures on the ground of India's geographical location, Nehru presented the location of the conference and the development of Asian countries under the leadership of India as a kind of naturally determined condition. And it is what I took from Asian Relations Organization's publication, where he is quoted, "It is fitting that India should play her part in this new phase of Asian development. Apart from the fact that India herself is emerging into freedom and independence, she is the natural center and focal point of the many forces at work in Asia. Geography is a compelling factor, and geographically she is so situated as to be the meeting point of Western and Northern and Eastern and Southeast Asia. Because of this, the history of India is a long history of her relations with the other countries of Asia. Streams of culture have come to India from the West and the East and been absorbed in India, producing the rich culture which is India today. At the same time, streams of culture had flowed from India to distant parts of Asia. If you would know India, you have to go to Afghanistan and Western Asia, to Central Asia, to China and Japan, and to the countries of Southeast Asia, where you will find magnificent evidence of the vitality of India's culture, which spread out and influenced vast numbers of people." So if you're actually familiar with Nehru's book, Discovery of India, you probably notice that this kind of words, in particular this last two sentences, echoes Tagore's words, which Nehru also published, cited in his book, The Discovery of India, which was published in 1946. However, it is completely unjustified to bring back that part of the narrative on Indian colonies and present this as Nehru's views at the Asian Relations Conference. Because as Ben already yesterday, I think, mentioned it, how he wrote this book is a bit another story, what he presented at the International Asian Conference. We can argue also that this kind of discovery of India, which included chapter on the discourse on Greater India, and which was actually even planned or even was made into this kind of event at the Asian African Conference, we could argue that it was still there, this kind of framework of Indian colonies in Southeast Asia. However, I would say that that doesn't really fit, because this kind of rhetoric of Greater India is not at the Asian conference in Delhi. Why? Because in relation to Indian history in Asia, Nehru emphasized the reciprocal relationship between Asian countries without invoking that kind of supremacy of one culture over others. He referred to ancient Indian intercourse with its neighbors as a testimony of one of the earliest and most harmonious unions of cultures from Egypt, Iran, Afghanistan to Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and other Asian regions. According to Nehru, there was not only India that influenced Indochina, for instance, or Indonesia, but also China, that great country to which Asia owes so much and from which so much is expected, or Egypt and the Arab countries of Western Asia, inheritors of a proud country, which spread far and far wide and influenced India as well. So these relations among and between Asian countries, which existed before it was broken off by European imperialism, were used by Nehru, of course, but it was used as a testimony to create this kind of Asian unity that, once it was reconstructed, could function as a force in fighting imperialism and bringing about universal human freedom. At this Inter-Asian Relation Conference, Greater India was absent almost at all roundtable, where there was a roundtable on culture problems, where actually we have reports that the participants were, for instance, Majumdar, Kalidas Nag, or Ganguly, who were actually the main, or among the main protagonists of the Greater India, but they remained in the background. The Hindu imperialism that Majumdar or Kalidas Nag constructed in the publications of the Greater India Society seems to have been ignored even at the archaeological exhibition, which was organized to accompany this Inter-Asian Relations Conference. And in describing the aim of the Inter-Asian Exhibition of Art and Archaeology, its officer in charge, Agrawala, who was also the curator of Central Asian Antiquities Museum in Delhi, proposed that, well, India occupy a predominantly central position. As he wrote, the history of India is linked with the history of the immense continent of Asia, and similarly, the history and culture of Asia were constantly influenced from India. The exhibition was organized to illustrate this twofold intercourse between India and her neighboring countries of Asia and the ancient classical world. Although India was here described as a center point in developing close international context, yet it was Central Asia, which was framed as a meeting point for different cultures by referring to Central Asia, in particular Chinese Turkestan, as the kind of heart of Asia, where four civilizations, and here I'm quoting him, where four civilizations, Greco-Bactrian, Iranian, Indian, and Chinese, met and mingled with one another around the central theme of Buddhism. This view fitted quite well with the Central Asian Antiquities Museum, which was the host of this archaeological exhibition. The prevailing view was that cultures developed through a process of mutual reciprocal exchange, as, for instance, Greco-Roman influence on Indian culture, as well as the Buddhist influence on Central Asia or on Southeast Asia. Buddhism also dominated in the report of the exhibition, where Buddhist objects were presented to illustrate not only how Buddhists traveled abroad from India, but also how Buddhists came to India from Southeast Asia. According to Agrawala, Southeast Asia received strong influence from India in the domain of religion, language, art, and architecture, to which archaeological remains in this region bear testimony. He further described this area as the orbit of India's cultural empire, which once embraced these distant lands for several centuries. However, this kind of suggests that Agrawala was probably more careful not to be seen as representing a Hindu imperialism theme at this Inter-Asian exhibition. So it was not so much the history of Indian cultural influences that was avoided at this event, at the conference in Delhi, as the framing of both cultural influence in that kind of very conventional Greater India language. Indian influence were acknowledged by the delegates from Cambodia, Malaya, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others, who in their speeches or comments express kind of appreciation for the way that Indians spread their cultural achievements instead of political power. And here just a few quotations. What the delegate from Indonesia expressed, that for centuries Indonesia has been visited by various kinds of guests. Some came with good intentions, like the Indians, while others entered our country with deception and force, like the Dutch imperialists. The last uninvited and most unwelcome visitors were Japanese fascists who destroyed a big part of our culture and carried away valuables and riches. During these foreign dominations, it was only Dutch and the Japanese, respectively, could derive advantages from the arrival in Indonesia. Or like there was also kind of similar expression when a delegate from SAM said in his speech in greeting the conference that it is quite evident to all who have been to SAM, no matter whether on a brief visit or for a long period of residence, that Indian and Samese cultures, in spite of slight discrepancies, are almost identical, so much so that when viewed from the context of fundamentals, a unity of purpose becomes at once apparent to all observant eyes. As the great poet Rabindranath Tagore most aptly observed, Sam has preserved what India lost. The traces of this ancient Indian influence throughout Asia from the past was also used as a kind of precedent for establishing good relationships in the present and future. This rhetoric around cultural influences and relationships has been interpreted according to the interest of each Asian country and their own culture in terms of a kind of broader conceptions of a supposed brotherhood or unity of Asian people. The Asian Relation Conference in Delhi did not continue the Greater India discourse, which stood in contradiction with this anti-imperialistic character of the conference in itself. Even when cultural influence were recalled, we were rather framed in this kind of relation of reciprocity and used as an argument to establish further connections. India was not a Hindu India of the Vedic ages, but a nation whose ancestors, including the ancestors of Pandit Nehru, in the words of the president of the conference, Rojini Naidu, were influenced by the streams that came from Western Asia, the streams that came with all the depths from the Arab world, the great democratic ideals that came through the Arab traders. So the Greater India theme was quite obvious, I think, that it was absent at this conference. It was also absent in the publications of the Indian Council of World Affairs, which was founded in 1943, and which was this official convener of the Asian Relations Conference. In United Asia International Journal of Asian Affairs, whose first inaugural number, Asia Week, appeared in 1948, so it was an anniversary of the Asian Relation Conference. In this magazine, United Asia, we do see how it was this Asian Relation Conference recalled. This monthly magazine was published in Bombay, and among the editorial representatives of the United Asia were also journalists not only from India but also from Indonesia, Malaya, and other countries. United Asia contained a lot of speeches and reports from various conferences, which also happened after this Asian conference, because there were conferences also which happened in June in 1947 in Madras, or in Calcutta in 1948, or even the conference, Asian Conference on Indonesia in 1949 in Delhi, which also sometimes is referred as a second Asian Relation Conference, right? But in those reports, there was no discussion on Greater India. Yet, Greater India was still used and applied as a cultural reason for establishing, for instance, the Southeast Asian Union, in an article written by Indian Sri Rangarajan for the United Asia in 1948. And by arguing that this kind of term Southeast Asia has not been clearly defined. He proposed rather to include, under this Southeast Asia terminology, India, Pakistan, Ceylon, and Nepal, besides the Southeast Asian countries, which were generally taken, according to him, like Burma, Malaya, Indochina, Siam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. But it seems to me that the real argument to include Southeast Asia under this terminology of Southeast Asia seems to be this kind of his perception of India as a mother of Asian culture, as a mother civilization of Asian culture. Because just to bring one big quote from his article, as he wrote, the first Asian Relation Conference held in New Delhi in 1947, if it has not achieved anything else, demonstrated to the world the fundamental unity of the outlook and life of the Asian peoples. It showed that in spite of the huge distances, mountain and river barriers, the Asian people have a feeling of brotherhood and friendliness towards each other, which befit peoples of the same continent. Secondly, India being the mother of Asian cultures, countries like Nepal, Ceylon, Burma, Siam, Indochina are bound by common ties of religion, for instance, Buddhism. Actually, these countries came under what has been called by historians Greater India. In the early centuries of the Christian era, it would have been difficult to distinguish clearly between Indian culture and the culture of their neighbors. So much were they influenced by Indian language, religion, customs, and manners, arts, and science. Since then, Indian cultural influence was never entirely eradicated, and even today, in spite of political isolation, there's much more that is common between Indian culture and the culture of the Southeast Asian countries than is the case otherwise. Sri Rangarajan referred to the Asian Relation Conference in his article published in the United Asia magazine, not only by offering this kind of cultural reasons, for instance, for a Southeast Asian Union, but also by discussing the claims about India's leadership in Asia. The conference had mentioned the need to overcome a fear of domination by one of the Asian countries, which he claimed was promoted merely by Western propaganda. He repeated Nehru's words that there are actually no leaders or no followers, and argued that because of the history of India, which has a consistent record of non-aggression as well as pacific intentions, of such leaders of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, who fought for the freedom of India for a generation, any plans of Indian domination of Asian countries are purely imaginary. The fear of Indian domination could not be overcome, probably, without reframing India's place in Asia away from a Greater India thematic. Because, as I mentioned, it was kind of Greater India was in itself terminology which was used under one framework, namely on Hindu colonies. And this a move away from the implications of Greater India and towards a defense against fears of India's leadership in Asia, while still framing India's geography and history as the reason for advocating closer ties with Asia and Southeast Asia in particular in world politics, was evident in the speeches and writings by many Indians. I'm not sure if I have another example. Just to illustrate that it wasn't only one article, but there were quite a few articles who discussed, in which Indian authors discussed this kind of India's cultural domination in Asia through the notion of India as a cultural mother of Asia. And this article was written by Rajan, who was the former Assistant Secretary of the Asian Relation Organization and a member also of the Indian Council of World Affairs. So very similarly to this kind of rhetoric of India's commitment to civilize Asia and whereby make its contribution to humanity, the conference in Delhi was considered to be the great landmark in the history of Asia and the world, which demonstrated that in spite of superficial differences in race, religion, and social structures, the people of Asia had a certain fundamental unity. Rajan intended India's role to secure Asian unity without using this kind of political, economic, or militant force. India, according to him, thanks to its commanding position in the continent of Asia, was already determined through her geographical position. According to Rajan, while India's geographical position was the meeting place of different races, cultures, and religions, India not only influenced these various Asian peoples, but also began to play the role of a great power in intra-Asian affairs. And he framed the relationship of India with other Asian countries through cultural relations, which would lead to the establishment of the Indian cultural unity of Asia. Quoting him, the people of Asian countries are bound to each other by historical, cultural, and religious ties. It is largely in the sense that there exists a fundamental unity among these people. Until her modern political isolation, India had extensive cultural intercourse with all Asian countries. She has been, in fact, called the cultural mother of Asia. One few even go so far as to say that instead of stating that India and other Asian countries had distinct cultures and that these later cultures were influenced by Indian culture, we should consider the whole of Asia as a single Indian cultural unit, in which the cultures of different Asian countries represent various stages of the development of the same Indian culture. While shaping her foreign policy towards Asian countries, India will naturally, therefore, be influenced by this historic and cultural consideration. It is partly due to this reason, and not with any political objective, that India has been championing the cause of Asian people and of the economic and cultural regeneration. In a small measure, she has herself been trying to revive these ancient connections by sending cultural missions and by arranging for the exchange of scholars and students, etc. So it is hard not to see, in this case, also Rajan's implications of India's superiority in Asia, as well as his suggestion that Asian cooperation should lead from India, if not by India. So this kind of impression that a united India, this magazine United India, was a greater India in another name, was sometimes difficult to avoid, I should admit. It could also be stated that what was not discussed or what was ignored at this Asian Relation Conference in Delhi was brought to this quite international magazine of a United Asia. And here I will bring you to a different story, namely how Indonesia approached towards Greater India, but also Asia. So a different perception of Indian influence, and in this case on Indonesia, was held by Indonesian writers, who were also wrote and published essays in this international magazine published in India in the United Asia. However, colonialism, which was condemned at this Inter-Asian conference in any form, was not made a theme in Indonesian writers' essays on Indonesia's past under Indian influence, which Indian historians had framed as this Greater India. Indian influence in Indonesia was accepted and discussed by Indonesians, however, without assuming any implication of cultural subordination or colonialism, not to mention that there was no reference to this term of Greater India. So what was interpreted by Indian protagonists of the Greater India discourse, and it was interpreted as a complete assimilation and transplantation of Indian civilization, was discussed by Indonesians as a kind of adaptation and integration into their own Indonesian culture. And this adaptation and integration, as for instance Indian epics into Indonesian cultural settings, or as Indonesian author Sularko expressed it, into a harmonious Indonesian unity, was interpreted as very characteristically Indonesian way in dealing with a foreign influence. He presented that an organized state already existed before the arrival of Hindus, and claimed that the continuous flow of the Hindu immigrants from India from the 1st to the 7th century AD shaped the Indonesian culture and influenced deeply Indonesian civilization. But there was no suggestions in all those writings by Indonesians that Indonesia was a Hindu colony or colonized in terms of culture. The implication was rather that the influence, including those from India, had shaped Indonesia into very present day through all this integration into the culture which already existed there. The Hindu and Buddhist culture was embraced by Indonesians and perceived as having been brought by the Indians, by immigrants or monks from India. And according to one article on Indonesian history, which was published also in the United Asia magazine, most of the immigrants from India followed Hinduism. It seems that Hinduism found favor with the Indonesians of the upper class and they became converts. Before Buddhist missionary activities reached Indonesian archipelago, Hinduism was a knowledge religion of almost all inhabitants of Indonesia. Hinduism and Buddhism were seen in religious and cultural terms, and the population of Indonesia was viewed as being, or presented as being actively engaged in developing this kind of new influences. The Indonesian inhabitants were described as devoted to bringing about this kind of cultural change within their own society. So this adoption of Buddhism and Hinduism among the local rulers was closely based on their own initiative and their own interest in bringing those influence into their own Indonesian society. The trading and cultural connections between India and Indonesia, which were traced back to the 1st century AD, did not keep with the prevalence of Islam. And that is where we see also quite different perception of influence which came from India. Because in Indonesian narratives, the assimilation and spread was not only of Hinduism and Buddhism, but also Islam, which came also from India to Indonesia, and which was discussed in that period of medieval Indonesia, that was marked by a history of various trading and naval empires. The Indonesian habit of assimilating and integrating foreign elements was viewed as a characteristic feature or a genius of Indonesian civilization that was shaped from immigration waves during already the Neolithic or Bronze Ages before the coming of the Hindu culture to Indonesia. Geographical location was also used as an argument for developing this kind of Indonesian culture, and taking into consideration the fact that Indonesia had continuously received various waves of immigration since prehistoric times, it was quite often argued that it was natural to frame Indonesia as a bridge connecting Asia with the Pacific continent and Iceland, and to a lesser degree with Africa. So Indonesia's adoption of various cultures flowing from Asian regions since the prehistoric age served to present Indonesia as a meeting place of Asia's cultural heritage. And this was also emphasized in the rhetoric that emphasized Indonesia's close relation with Asian countries, particularly with regard to India. India's contribution to the Indonesian culture was mentioned not only by historians, but also by Indonesian politicians. It was in the previous slides, where we had this message to India sent by Indonesian politician and that circulated in various Indian press in the late 1940s. As we can see, it was republished from the magazine The Hindu. So it was the message of the vice president of Indonesia, Muhammad Hatta, who was Nehru's close friend. They met, if I'm not mistaken, in Brussels already in 1927. So we can see already that India's close relations with Indonesia were regarded by reference to this kind of cultural connection. And here in this message, I'm not sure whether you can read, where he said also that Indian civilization molded the course of our culture. However, this was well short of an acceptance of this kind of Greater India framework. This approach to the Indian impact on Indonesia by Indonesian politicians can be seen also in the Indonesian publication of another leader. And this is a quite old book, which was written by, very short actually, book, written by the first president of Indonesia, Sukarno, in 1933 in the south of Bandung. And in his book, he actually denied that Indonesia's relationship with India comprised any form of power, including imperialistic culture. And in this book, which he started actually by citing Dutch professor Pieter Wit, who, according to Sukarno, wrote, once said that, Dutch professor once said that, in fact, Indonesia was never independent. From ancient times to the present, Indonesia has always been a colony. First Hindu colony, then a Dutch colony. And Sukarno started with correcting him by saying that he forgets that there is a distinguished difference in depth between the days of Hindu and the sense of today. He forgets that Hindu age was not necessarily affirmation of Hindu power, which did not mean a Hindu power usurpation over Indonesia. According to him, Hindus established a culture, but that culture was not a culture from above, not an imperialistische Kultur, but a culture that lived and flourished with the Indonesian people. So this kind of relationship with Hindustan was not one of power, not that in the sense of government, not of Macht, but of one civilization or one culture. In short, as he said, in those ancient times, the country of Indonesia was neither a colony nor a Hindu country nor a Hindu state. And reading further, kind of Sukarno attempted to emphasize that there was already indigenous people and they had their own culture before arrival of Indian culture. And this assimilation of Indian culture was with the local culture, and that impact and dominance was actually received by the locals. And this approach can be also interpreted as an instance of Indonesian discourse on the national, or constructing a national Indonesian culture. And just very briefly to give you the context, so Indonesian public discourse in the late 1940s and also in the 1950s actually dominated by debates on Indonesian history, identity, and culture, and its affinity to Asia, and in particular, affinity to South Asia. Indonesia's culture was presented as a kind of meeting point for different cultures that had influenced Indonesian culture throughout its history. And it was kind of always emphasized this kind of Indonesian character by adapting foreign cultures for the enrichment of Indonesian culture. And India's support in international politics was also one of the reasons why, I guess, the Indonesian media at that time really dominated by Indian politicians and essays on Indian history, culture, and religions. And this is just to give you also that influence, that relationship between India and Indonesia, that India played a huge role on the diplomatic stage to support Indonesia. Yeah, and just another example, so we have this quite popular member, Indonesia, Majalah Merdeka, which had a lot of actually essays on also on developing, constructing Indonesian culture, but also on other issues. And in this magazine, which presented itself, first was published in 1947 and presented itself as an independent journal for building the nation, for discussion of political, economic, and social questions, and for developing Indonesian culture. So it is just one quotation from the article of Indonesian writer Sukmono, who actually quite heavily criticized the book Sejarah Kebudayaan Indonesia, which is a history of Indonesian culture, and why that this author relied very heavily on Dutch literature and not on kind of new literature which was written by other scholars. He admitted that the influence of Indian culture on our country has been tremendous. So tremendous that one would think that it's impossible to study the culture history of Indonesia without knowing as much as possible about ancient India. Foreign influence in Indonesia is formulated by describing the indigenous culture of Indonesia that not only existed before arrival of the foreign culture, but was also mature enough to accept and synchronize it with the local one. And in terms of Indonesia's relations with Asian countries, India, of course, was the country that dominated this discourse on Indonesian history and culture. But in this review, Indonesian author Sukmono also highlighted the fact that people take Indian history for granted, that then they should actually be studying it, while strongly criticizing the book, as I said, that the author was relying too heavily on Dutch scholarship and ignoring the more up-to-date literature, but also what he emphasized, that ignoring the cultural history of Indonesia before Indonesians came. So the investigation of Indonesian culture is now based on Indonesia-centric. We no longer focus on external influence, but on the fact of how our nation from century to century has received and cultivated this foreign influence to be served as its own. It could be argued that the importance of Indians' influence on Indonesian culture was kind of the reason for the increased emphasis on the need to delve deeper into Indonesian culture before the arrival of Indians. And here, I guess I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jolita, for a very dense and enlightening talk. And I would invite you to join me, and I'm sure there are questions. Whoa, okay. Andrea has the first question, and then Philippe. Yeah.
With my moving voice, I might need the microphone.
No, for the internet.
Oh, yeah. Otherwise, people online can't hear you. Yeah.
Jolita, thank you for your interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to reading your book, which in many ways relates to what I do, so I asked the university to buy it. And I'll be reading it soon. My question to you is this idea of a greater India. I mean, you showed to us right now some of the ways in which this idea played out in the relationship between India and Indonesia as nation states, so in the diplomatic relations between two countries. And of course, you refer to the period, the Republican period, and the aid that India provided to Indonesia. But my question to you is there another dimension? And again, here, just I don't know if you delved into that, but is there any other dimension in which actually this idea of a greater India had a negative impact on the relations between Indonesia and India? And that's my question, but I don't know if you cover it in your book or in your research, so please feel free to shut it down. But I was extremely curious I was burning to ask you these questions, and so I did. Thank you.
If you want to connect.
No, just
Maybe briefly, because in the Indonesian case, I haven't really came across to this kind of negative story. But what I came across that quite often we referred to the names like Kalidas Nag, who was the main protagonist in India of this greater India narrative. So it gave me idea that we were familiar what Kalidas Nag was writing, because basically almost in all his writings, Greater India is there, and very explicitly on that kind of Hindu colonization framework, right? But we didn't refer to this kind of narrative. They even didn't refer to Greater India. Or I haven't came across yet. Maybe so, I would say. But we were more criticizing this kind of Dutch literature, especially when Indonesians were relying on the Dutch literature, by arguing that there are already new literature written also by Indian scholars who could be actually more beneficial to refer in their own Indonesian writings on history.
Thank you, because in my reading of diplomatic...
Can we have more questions?
I'll
Yeah.
talk to you after lunch.
Yes,
Oh,
at lunch, yes. Philippe.
Thank you, Jolita. It's such an amount of amazing also information and documents that would have been super interesting also for our exhibition that we were making. But there is one thing that I don't know, maybe you also have it as part of your research. In 1927, when Nehru met Mohammed Hatta in Brussels, Rabindranath Tagore met Sukarno in Indonesia. There is discussion around that, whether that really happened, etc. But there's all this story that he escaped his Dutch watchmen in order to meet Sukarno. And what's very interesting is that maybe he was in the search for a greater India, and this greater India idea was always like located in the past. But something else happened along that way, which is, he discovered this wonderful batik production that he thought was something that he would bring back to India. So Rabindranath Tagore brought a whole collection of batik, Indonesian batik, to Santiniketan above Kolkata in order to launch a whole new art production, which was not known in India at that time, or certainly not in that version. And Santiniketan becomes this laboratory for people like Ramkin Karbai and Edi Sunarso from Indonesia, but Ramkin Karbai, they develop some sort of new social realist vernacular. So is there maybe another project than this kind of like nostalgia to a greater India? Maybe there is a project that, and for us in the exhibition, that was also important to look at that there is some other form of metaphorical regionalism, a third way, that is also artistically kind of developed. And maybe it's kind of as a byproduct. For example, one of the very early publications of Home and the World by Rabindranath is illustrated with woodcuts from Sultan Harahap, who was an Indonesian artist. So there is this kind of like, and these woodcuts arguably are also social realist.
Yeah, you are referring what maybe some people don't know. So Tagore also founded this Vishwabharati University, right? And this university had also, as you said, students or like artists or like collaborations with some coming from Indonesia to this university. But I would argue like Tagore was used actually by this Greater India protagonist. If you read Greater India Society, it's on the first page, his message like written by Tagore, But to use Tagore also kind of as one of the protagonists of this Greater India, I wouldn't make that precisely of the point that because of Greater India Society members used that because they had also to legitimize the idea. And at that time, Tagore was already famous everywhere in the world. He was traveling not only to Southeast Asia, but everywhere, to Germany, to all countries, to Italy, I mean, and continuously he was traveling also to China and Japan. And that perception also, how Tagore was perceived in China or in Japan, is quite different, right? So, I mean, you could maybe bring his kind of like, as you suggest, this kind of third way, maybe in that kind of spiritual, which he was looking kind of for that India, which it was already lost at home in India itself. But he didn't really mention it, that perspective, what Greater India protagonist brought. He wasn't really claiming about this Hindu colonist or Hindu kingdoms, Hindu empires founded in those realms of Greater India. But it's definitely, I mean, there is space to bring, but maybe in kind of different perception, not in that narrative which was created by the Greater India protagonist in India.
Okay, we have 3 more questions, and looking at the time, I would like to close the list with that. And before I give you the microphone, we have 1 question online, and I would like to read that at first. My name is Aditya Vidyadi, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, and I'm from Indonesia. First, I would like to express my appreciation for Jolita's insightful presentation. At the same time, I would like to offer a suggestion for further enriching the study. It would be valuable to deepen the analysis through empirical research conducted in Indonesia. This could help illuminate the differences in how Hinduism is understood and practiced in Indonesia compared to India. In particular, fieldwork among communities such as the Chinese or Balinese could offer important perspectives.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I did my research on Indonesian part based only on books written by Indonesians and also what we published, and we published a lot in various magazines. Like this, Member Indonesia is only one of the quite huge amount. And I agree that, I mean, this kind of field work needs to be done. But it's, again, I think there are already done quite a few studies who did this kind of field work by looking how this Hinduism changed and how the traditions were developed through the time. I'm referring like not only from 1940s, but like later on, because there was kind of shift and change, the perception, and also this kind of rituals, how it is practiced in Indonesia.
Then we'll take the last 2 questions together.
Thank you very much for your presentation and sharing your views on that issue of Greater India's association with a Hindu past, as I understood it. And I wonder if you would care to share your views on perhaps more recent administrations that have attempted to form a vision of India with an association strongly with a Hindu past, and what will be the future of monuments, you know, in India and architecture of India that perhaps, such as the Lodi Gardens, the Humayun's tomb, Qutb Minar, or even gurdwaras that perhaps don't have a Mughal past, but that are they in any danger of being rewritten? And I raise this point only because I was in India on the 22nd of January 2024 when a Mughal-era Brahmi mosque was actually replaced by a Ram temple inaugurated in the northern city of Anodija. So would you care to share your views?
Maybe only very briefly. I would say that that the politics, I mean, present-day Indian politics, is using basically this greater India narrative. They are citing the scholars who brought this idea of greater India at the beginning of 20th century. We are citing with scholars like, for instance, Binoy Kumar Sharkar, that is actually the one who needs to be read by Indians. And Binoy Kumar Sharkar was like the main protagonist, not only on this kind of ancient Greater India, but he was actually also building the modern Greater India, which was based on this kind of cultural, ancient cultural colonization of India. But it was created that kind of this modern Greater India, which was based on migrants everywhere in the world, should be also kind of developed into the modern Greater India based on this kind of economic relationships. And so there is a lot what the government can use and take from this discourse. Regarding Islamic past, I mean, as I emphasized, Greater India was only up to Islam came. While as in Indonesia, we were also kind of brought those evidence where we said that, well, look, Islam came also, not only Hinduism and Buddhism came from India, but also Islam was brought by Sumatran missionaries, for instance, or they went themselves to India and they converted there and then came back to Indonesia, which is not the case in this Greater India narrative. So just as a suggestion.
Can I take it from there? Because you came to Binay Sharkar and I was going to surrender my question to lunch. But Sharkar, of course, is one of the main Indian fascists and the main collaborators with the Nazis. And he is often claiming authorship of the concept of Lebensraum. And he's also one of the characters who is close to Radha Kumud Mukherjee, who after the Second World War makes a claim for Asiatic Lebensraum in more of the Asian world, because he says that the Europeans should now be replaced and we should have space for the Asiatics in practical terms to grow more food for the rest of the world, but in civilizational terms to expand. And I just thought more of a comment than a question we could put it there.
No, that is a very good comment. I don't think that I need to elaborate more on this comment.
Okay, so first of all, let me thank you for a wonderful talk and discussion, and maybe join me.